And we are back with another one for black belts and boardrooms. I'm a big football fan. Preseason's almost done. So, of course, since we have another person from the NFL, I had to put on the Saints jersey. Of course, everyone knows how much I love my Saints, even back in the day with the bags over their heads, etc. I've always been a Saints fan. But, Amir, who do we have today?
Renard, speaking of football, I actually have a guest here today that has a connection with me because I grew up in Vegas, and this is about the Oakland Raiders, or formerly known as the Oakland Raiders, now the Las Vegas Raiders. So I am very excited for our listeners to have a insider view from Devon Buchanan. Evan, why don't you start out by giving us a little bit of your background, maybe an origin story, if that's up your wheelhouse?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, both of you, for inviting me on and to be a part of this conversation and to just get the opportunity to share a little bit about my story. If I can go back to an origin story, I would say my origin story starts in Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Brooklyn in the 90s. My mom was an immigrant from Jamaica. And so, for our family, a lot of that, I would say is our foundation growing up in a place like Brooklyn. But it wasn't until I moved to Florida, relocated to West Palm Beach, Florida, when I was, a young child, probably 7 years old, that I got introduced to the idea of sports. And, my mom tells the story of, growing up in New York, not really having access to so many sports or extracurricular activities outside of school. And so that was one of the reasons that she wanted to relocate and give us the opportunity to be involved in sports. It's funny that my first sport, a lot of people think it was football, but it was actually Taekwondo. I was talking a little bit of Bernard about this, but I had a sensei. His name was Sensei Pop Win. He actually recently just passed last year, and I look back on that as a second grader. I was in second grade when I first stepped into his dojo, and he was someone who really wanted to bring Taekwondo to inner city kids and to marginalized communities. And so, it was for me a great experience, especially as an introduction, to the discipline, but also to have, a mentor, a role model in the community and someone that was highly respected in our community who was doing these classes and, creating space for us to, just learn the art form. And so that was my introduction to sport. And then got into football, I would say around the fourth grade. That was my introduction to football. And so I found a love for football, a passion for it. I thought it was something that I really wanted to do at a young age. And, I pursued it as to the highest level I could. So I wound up getting a scholarship actually to the University of Louisiana, Lafayette, the Raging Cajuns. And it was, for me, it was incredible opportunity. I had never heard of the school before they recruited me. But the funny thing is, it was my only scholarship offer coming out of high school. And so there was a coach that came and he said he saw something in me and wanted to give me an opportunity. And so I was headed down to the bayou, to the swamps of Louisiana, and yeah, to further my career as far as playing, and then also to pursue a degree at the university. And so it was incredible. Had an amazing 4 year experience at the university. Became a 2 year starter, a team captain my senior year, and actually went on to win the first bowl game in school history my senior year with my senior class. And so really was amazing time. My time spent there, and so that moved on into an opportunity that came really out of my time at the university. I got an opportunity to try out for the Raiders coming out of school, and so a very unique situation. Draft passed and went, and I was sitting back thinking, okay, well, if I don't get a call, what is going to happen? What am I going to do next? And it's funny, the week of my graduation, I get a call from the Oakland Raiders, and a guy says, "Hey, we want to bring you in for a tryout." And I'm like, "Okay, well, I have graduation this Saturday." He said, "Well, do you want to play in the NFL or do you want to go to graduation?" So I made the decision to take the tryout, and so I wind up going to Oakland, having a essentially rookie minicamp, undrafted, free agent. Brought in They brought in probably 50 guys to try out, and essentially they're going to wean that down to about 8 spots to bring those guys into training camp. So when I got there, pretty soon I realized that in this numbers game that I was probably going to be odd man out with a lot of other guys, right? But the experience in itself was everything that I had dreamed of as a kid. I'm just putting on the helmet, running around. being able to be a part of something that very few people get a chance to, even get a chance to get to that level. And so after that moment, I returned home, and I was really just thinking of what is next for my career, or what am I going to do, or just looking for anything. Obviously transitioning out of sports was something that I had never really prepared for. I don't think that many people prepared a lot of us for as athletes. But my first real job, I never did an internship or anything. So my first real job that I had was supporting youth that were aging out of foster care. And so that introduction to the work, for me, was something that I look back on, and I think it changed my life for the better, especially because I was working with, young people who had, their own story, their own, experiences that had led them to where they were. And I was going through a transition myself, right? And so we were both able to support each other, and I didn't realize how much they were supporting me, to kind of help me find a passion outside of sports. And so I look at that as kind of like that moment that I really, kind of had to make a decision on what I was going to do. And so I looked at service as something that I was going to go into, and really just, frame that as a career. And so uh, you know, I remember the day I kind of made my mind up to do this, to go and to pursue it. I wound up getting my master's in social work at Barry University. It was actually the same university my mom attended and got her master's in social work. So, following in her footsteps, we had the same professors, a lot of the same experience. And, I look back on that time, when my mom was doing her graduate program, and I was probably about my sophomore, junior year in high school. And I remember those days of coming in and seeing her with, 5 or 6 textbooks sprawled out, and her writing a paper. And I just thought to myself, I would never do that, right? So to see it come full circle, get the opportunity to attend the same university, graduate, and just continue that legacy over at Barry University was pretty awesome. And so that essentially was the segue into where I am today. After I graduated, December of 2019, um, I had this gut feeling of like, hey, there's a way for you to try to get back into sports, and I couldn't shake this feeling that there was something on the cusp of this. And so I wound up starting a consulting company that was, framed around bringing mental health to athletics. And so I really wanted to just, take this newfound, information and a skill set that I'd gained through my time in the university, or Barry University, and I wanted to bring it to sports. And so I wound up doing this poster presentation, which I wound up presenting at a conference called the Black Student Athlete Summit. And something about being there and being in that moment, I really felt like, what, this is a space that I could really do something in. And just being there, networking, meeting people, I wound up meeting someone who would later refer me for a job with the Raiders. And as she framed it, she said, in our 15-minute conversation, we talked about, I passed through the Raiders on a tryout. I just graduated with my master's in social work. And so after that conference, a few days after, she sent me the job description for what was the director of alumni. And the job was literally, hey, we need a social worker that can help these guys transition from football. And the first thought was like, that's me. And so I wound up applying for the role. This is January of 2020. I actually found out about the role on my birthday after I came from skydiving, which many people look at think about that and it's just like, what are you doing up there? But yeah, it was just one of those moments in my life where I felt like, things were aligning. And wound up applying, getting the first interview, and COVID hit. So,
Right.
as you can imagine in that moment, right, all the suspense is building up. You're thinking this is about to, happen pretty much overnight, right? And then COVID slows everything down. And it really gave me the opportunity to really, continue the work that I was doing in my community. And so during that process, eventually things started to come back up, and started to interview again, and essentially got the role. It came down to me and another candidate, and that call, receiving that call from the Raiders to say, "Hey, you're coming on board." It felt like draft night. It felt like to have that opportunity to relive a moment that you dream of, and for me to be at my mom's house, for her to be there in that moment to experience it with me, especially with everything that was going on in the world at that moment, right? It was just, being able to capture that moment was something that was special. And so from there, I've been with the organization now for 5 years, and have transitioned into another role. So I moved into more so the diversity and inclusion and employee experience sector. And so this is, something that I've really just gained a passion for as I've, come on and started to do this work. But it definitely connects to a lot of my, background and experience. And so to be able to just learn more about the organization, to learn a little bit more about, you know, uh, the business of people, I would say that this has given me the opportunity to really expand my skill set and to really support the organization through this journey.
That's incredible. Devon, you said a few things in there that, first of all, I appreciate that you have so much in common with Renard and I. That's the first thing. Louisiana school,
Mhm.
living in Vegas, taekwondo, which is, my jam as well. But, all of those things, as amazing as they are, I can sense that there's a person who's always curious and always interested. So I want to start by asking you, how much of your passion in football was actually driven by your time spent in taekwondo?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's one that I don't get a chance to talk about a lot because a lot of people don't know my background. But as a kid, I was very aggressive. I was a big kid too, so I was bigger than most of my peers. And my mom saw that early. It was like, hey, if I don't, funnel this into something, then this could be something that could be a detriment, right? And so once I got into that dojo, for me, at that time too, this is kind of the late '90s. There was a lot of movies that were coming out that were very, martial art inspired, right? You had Beverly Hills Ninja, a Karate Kid, right? Like some of the Three Ninjas movies were coming out. So, me and my cousins were always trying to reenact these moves and doing things. But once I got immersed in the discipline, that was when I really like it opened my eyes. And my sensei, he was one that wanted to expose us and give us other opportunities to see outside of just the dojo that he was in. And so we went to tournaments. I got a chance to compete and do all those things. And that was for me was like the first time kind of being on a stage like that, right? Where you're, at a huge tournament and there's so many different, martial artists and the skill sets and you're seeing everything. And it reminded me of the movies, right? I was like, wow, like this is real, right? And so, that early years, I would say was the foundation for my discipline, foundation for, dealing with adversity, really in a sense, being able to manage your anger and be able to channel it. And so, the Nisi Goju was essentially his discipline. And so, I still know how to count in Japanese to about 10. Those early lessons, I thought, before I even got introduced to football, I thought, bringing some of those into football was something that was almost just, second nature. And I think, the two, as far as martial arts and, the sport of football, I think they're very much linked, especially with some of the discipline and some of the aspects that you can gain from in your personal life. And so, I look at that, and I also look at, the service aspect of what I got from being introduced to the dojo, and to see, my sensei, he was a black man, right, learning this discipline and teaching it to others in the community. And he would do classes for free. He would go all over West Palm Beach and teach these classes. And so just that earlier on and seeing that and being able to as I got older, run into his daughter and tell her stories about, hey, your dad changed my life. You know what I mean? Those things were things that I really held close to me because you really never know the impact that you'll have on somebody years down the road. And that was something I always wanted to give back to him. Like, hey, you were the person that saw something in me probably before anyone else did. And for him to be able to hear that before he passed, that was something that meant a lot to me. So it definitely is a foundation that I been able to build on. But a lot of it was those early years.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I wanna go back. I love the connection all 3 of us have. You got Vegas, Louisiana, Taekwondo. The funny thing is, and I've told him, Amir, I took Taekwondo first before I took jujitsu. When I was a kid, I went Taekwondo was big in New Orleans. That's what you took. Nobody heard of jujitsu yet, so, don't get me wrong, I didn't go to the level that Amir is. He's a 3rd degree black belt, but I got to take it, so I definitely understand the discipline and what it gives you, in the long run and how you feel like in a sense you want to give back. But I want to talk about, now you're working for the Raiders now. And before you got your new title now, you were just dealing with the transition of players transitioning out of football. Could you tell us what that's like for somebody who's transitioning out of something that they love so much and knowing that, hey, I got to retire now.
Yeah. Man, it was one of those things that I felt, when I got into the work. Like people say, bringing your full self to work. That was one of those opportunities where I felt I can bring every experience that I'd gotten, whether it was, things I learned in the classroom as a social worker to be able to support, families, or whether it was experiences that I had on the playing field or the locker room that I could bring to conversations, right? The reality of the work was and it is heavy. It's heavy work, right? Because you're able to see the gamut of the realities of football, right? And the positivity of it as well, I think isn't covered enough. I think there's a lot of stories about obviously after sports, the plight of the athletes after sports, right? Essentially, bankruptcy, divorce, all those things, right? But I really got a chance to see, what some of these men had done after their playing careers. Notably, I would say the ones who played in the early days, I would say the ones who built the NFL, right? These were guys that weren't making a king's ransom to play the game, right? And getting a chance to be on the phones and cold call guys and connect them back to the organization was something that I really, really enjoyed because I just could imagine myself being on the other end of that call, right? Hey, this is so and so with the Raiders. Just wanted to call and check up on you, and touch base. And for a lot of those guys, that was probably one of their first touch points with the organization since they'd left. And with sports, right? Depending on how it plays out, you may have, some personal feelings or personal attachment to that experience. And so, for us, it was really just being able to meet guys where they were. Hey, we're the Raiders. We're here for you. You played for this organization, and the Raiders are different. I would say definitely in this space when it comes to alumni, like no other. I would say team, no other organization. Our owner, obviously Mark Davis and his dad Al Davis, you know, their commitment to these players are different. These men really care about who these players were and how they supported this organization, how they built this organization. And so, other alumni programs kind of have a different process of who is technically an alumni. Where here at the Raiders, if you played in one game, you're an alumni. You have the same access to this as some of the greats. And so I always looked at that, especially with someone who passed through this organization and for only 3 days, right? Like what is that of value to these men, right? But the way that I was received by a lot of these men, based on what I was doing and how I was supporting them and supporting their brothers, right? That was something that I always kind of kept really close to me through the experience. The realities of the work was, we dealt with everything from, supporting a player as they were having their first child or, having a child to, really dealing with the realities of, you know, supporting, families with, having players that are going into hospice, right? So you kind of saw the gamut of life to death and especially with the demographic, right? The age gaps or the generations of alumni. So we had guys that were, part of the original Raiders that we call them OG Raiders, the 1960 team, right? These guys, some of them in their 90s. So their care is a little bit different, right? Quality of life is a little bit different when we come and support them versus a guy who's transitioning, maybe 24, 25, maybe played 2 years in the league and has their whole life ahead of them to think about what am I going to do next. And so that was really what we were seeing, and really building around programming and support and connecting them to resources. I like to compare it a lot to, with the VA, veteran services, right? That, a lot of it is really connecting, those men to, and men and women to those resources that they have earned, right? And so a lot of it from the NFL's perspective was that, a lot of players didn't really know the gamut of what they had earned through the NFL. And so it was us helping to connect them to those resources and how to reach out to those service providers and really just kind of create that engagement. So it was something that I like during that time that I was able to do it. I really enjoyed it. It was something that healed parts of me through my experience, to be able to bring that to these men and their families. But it also at times would be something because you're so close to it, right? And that you have teammates who are dealing with the same things right now in their phase of life, and so at times it could be a little heavy. But I would never trade it in, to be able to say that I've had a chance to serve, not only just an alumni, but Raiders alumni was something that I'll, always kind of have pride in. And that's something that I'll carry for the rest of my life.
That's a great story. I feel like, and I want to peel back a little layer for. I feel like that mental health aspect that you were speaking of earlier helped you have those conversation with them. Am I correct in saying that?
Absolutely, right? And you can think about it, right, from the standpoint of you're dealing with maybe some of the most stoic men in history, right? I mean, guys who wouldn't even admit that they were hurt, or that they're feeling pain, right? So it's almost trying to gauge, right, or speak their language because it's coded at sometimes, right, where they won't give you too much information or too much insight into what they're dealing with because of their pride, right? Which understandably makes sense. I think what I was really my approach was to kind of kind of lower the defense or the guards, right? And if it was through my lived experience or through sharing the experience, whether it be secondhand through players that I've seen or guys that I've known, I think that was really just a way for us to connect. And then, a big part of it too was also realizing and recognizing that I'm not going to be able to connect to everyone, right? And so what we did in that case was create programming that would allow us to reach as many alumni as possible. So one was our peer-to-peer program, and so we built this program to think about the multiple generations. If I'm reaching out to a guy who had never heard my name or heard from me, there may not be an opportunity for me to speak about benefits, right? Um, a lot of times guys would think I'm calling from the NFL and there was, contention there because of some of the benefits that they were trying to access. And so what we realized was that, that this peer program could be something to create that introduction or at least to try to, help understand what guys are navigating. And then that way they can, push those players back over to us. And then we're starting the conversation with more context, rather than kind of probing and digging into people's personal experiences. Right. And so we found that that was very much a game changer for us because we were able to now, have our alumni support others and be able to bring their lived experience to the forefront and be able to support guys and make that introduction, especially with being able to say, "Hey, I'm one of you." And so we thought that that was really a good way for us to, make sure we're not missing anybody, that no one's kind of falling through the cracks. And so we even, were helping to find guys that were essentially out of touch with the organization or may not have had a contact information for them. A big part of, identifying a lot of those players were when the team relocated to Vegas, we had a program with the new stadium that we call the Legacy Brick. Every alumni, if you had played one game with the Raiders, you were given a legacy brick. And so that brick is right in the front of the stadium. As you walk up to the stadium, you can find every alumni who's ever played for this organization has a brick. And then we sent them a brick to their house so that way they can have that and commemorate their legacy. And so I think that program it just speaks to the organization, but also right for a lot of those men, it was also, maybe the first time that they had received or even heard from the Raiders, or maybe they even think that they weren't actually a Raider because they only did this, right? And I think that brick program was really just a way for us to, hey, as we're moving into our new home, we want you to understand that because you helped build this, that your legacy is cemented here in front of this building. And so that I think, when we used to go around and do tours for our alumni, bring them to the stadium, and we end the stadium tour, they're in front of their brick and their family is there. And I mean, that moment, for a lot of those men, it means something because, no telling what their life had been like afterwards. I think a lot of men sometimes just need to remember who they were, what they've accomplished no matter if they saw it small or big. I think sometimes, it's important, to just to remember what you've done and accomplished. And I thought that was something that we, when we implemented that, that was it changed the program, changed the alumni program.
And all I can say, how can I become a Raider? Hell, not I know I got a Saints jersey on and everything, but how can I become a Raider? Because I feel like the word that comes to mind, the way you're talking is being seen. That's the word that comes to mind through that experience. It's they understand, "Hey, I was seen being a Raider." They remember me, even though it might like you said, it might have been one game. I might have just suited up for practice, but I'm being seen, and that's what a lot of people need. They just wanna be seen, they wanna be heard, and what you did at that time and what the Raiders are still doing is, man, that you probably do have a point. Like, no, I don't know if other organizations are doing the same thing, but it made me want to say, man, what can I do in order to become a raider and just experience that type of, like I said, the word being seen. And now you're at the senior director, your DEI and employee experience. If you could tell us what that's like. What's your day to day going forward?
Yeah, so I transitioned into to the D&I space or DEI space about 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years now. I mean, I've been here for 5 years. So I jumped into this role, and it was really an opportunity for me, you know, crossing over from alumni, really, everything that I just spoke to you guys about, right? Really, really proud of the work that we were able to do. But this was an opportunity, one, and also a challenge for me that I thought this gets me closer to understanding, the business, the organization from a people's lens, right? Working with the alumni, I thought, was really an opportunity for me to be able to lend my skills to that. But especially with DEI, right? It was something that I really felt like, hey, if I can, really do this at this organization, especially with the history of this organization in this space, it was something that I felt though being able to capture, especially the work that I've done with alumni, that these are two things that I think are synonymous to the Raiders' legacy. When we think of, how we treat our alumni, and then also we think about, D&I or DEI, as it comes to social justice and Al Davis and his legacy. The Raiders in itself are known for some of the first historical hires or trailblazing hires. You Tom Flores, who was the first Hispanic head coach, the one that won a Super Bowl, two Super Bowls to be specific, right? You had Jim Plunkett as his quarterback, right? Who was also a Hispanic quarterback, also a Heisman Trophy winner, right? You think about, uh, you know, the first black head coach, Art Shell, when he was given the role or essentially earned the role by from Al Davis, and was able to lead this team. Amy Trask was the first female CEO, and now we have Sandra Douglas Morgan, who was the first Black president, a female president, especially at the organization. And so, those are, obviously what many people from outside kind of see from the organization and said, "Wow, they've always kind of been, progressive." Obviously, think about the HBCU history here, players coming through this organization, and so a lot of our legacy and our history, right, is rooted in this work. But I think, in today's time, right, this work has evolved, and so I get a chance to see the evolution of this work, especially right now in this current time. And so, being able to bring this work, I'm currently within the human resource vertical of our organization, but to be in the people business, right, as I call it, it's important to understand like your employee base, right? It's important to understand like who is the future of who is going to build this organization to where it's going. And so being a part of, that initiative is really to your point of how we looked at our alumni program of being seen, right? A sense of belonging, right? That you're essentially capturing that now for people in their current experience. The reality for alumni is that, a lot of their experience is past, right? And we understand that a lot of things that we can't capture for them in this moment, that because that moment is essentially past from a player's perspective. But during the employee experience, I think this is the opportunity that we have to create experiences and touch points for employees that, give them the foundation to where they go off and what they become and what they do, even if it's not here with the Raiders. And so my day to day really right now, it's, building building policies. One of the things that we also do is employee resource groups, making sure that we have spaces for employees to be able to, show up, but also those spaces are, inclusive, truly an opportunity for us to make sure that we're capturing the gamut of experiences, especially from a cultural perspective. So as we've been, building along, it's been really cool to see how much employees have embraced this work. I would say my role is an inaugural role. And so, when I first jumped into it, I was apprehensive at first of like, okay, there's no roadmap, right? There isn't anything that I'm, going to be able to lean off of. And so, I really wanted to build this with the employee voice behind it. And so being able to go around the organization and, sit with people and learn a little bit more about, what is it that they want to see from their experience at all levels, right? Because, what SVPs are looking for are different from what coordinators may be looking for, right? And obviously the age is different, the multiple generations in the workplace. So I really feel like the alumni experience really gave me an opportunity to learn some of those nuances. And then now transitioning over into this role, you can't do this work without feedback. And so I leverage that to the best of my ability and just use that to, really guide this work because I can't do it in a vacuum, right? And so it definitely has allowed me to really understand a little bit more of the talent that we have in this organization. I mean, it's incredible to see. I would say I get a chance to see it up close and personal. And so a lot of people think of the NFL and they just think of game day, right? They see Sunday, the product that we put on the field, and they see everything that kind of builds around it. But, leading up to that, being able to be privy to some of those, conversations and some of the thoughts, the innovation that's going on behind the scenes, that has really captivated me because I was like, oh, wow, people really knew, everything that goes into a game day production or just building up to it. I think more people would have a better understanding of what the NFL obviously captures, right? With so many different departments, so many different, individuals that contribute to this. And so that was really my biggest takeaway when I got here was, really the talent, but also, how can we, support this talent, especially through whether it be, ways in which we can engage them, ways in which we can have touch points throughout the year, recognition programs. So all those different things that, really give people that holistic experience of being a Raider. So that way, that we're capturing that for them the same way that we are for the alumni.
Yeah. So Devon, you have such a rich mastery of the history that is the Raiders. I can hear you name names. I can hear you talk about how it was pioneering in that space. And I look at your background and I say, you know what? Devon himself is actually kind of pioneering. Here's this new inaugural role you're leading, and you've now had 5 years experience both as a player as well as somebody who is now you know, leading the organization effectively. So, how has your leadership style been impacted by all of these different experiences? Is there any lessons that you would like to share that are replicable in other environments that has shaped you in the leader that you are? Maybe some mentors even in the organization.
Yeah. Oh man, I think about really going back to my college days. I would say I had a coach, and he really, I would say, he changed the course of my life with this conversation we had. I can remember being probably my sophomore year, um, and I thought this coach didn't like me. Right? I was convinced he didn't like me. I think a part of it was I had to believe that, so that way, right? But he challenged me one day. Came in, and I was off. I was one of those, guys that if my energy was off, then everybody felt it. And he called it out. He said, "Hey, listen, when you're on, everybody gets to be on. Everybody gets to, to be able to be their full selves. But he said, when you're off, he said, dude, you're like cancer. It's fresh." And
Mm.
I remember like how bad it stung hearing that like 20 years old, right? I'm like, cancer, like my goodness, right? But he was right. He was so right. Because I didn't understand like the importance of influence, right? And it's like there's so many people who have influence that don't sign up for it, that may not even want it, right? But ultimately it's yours. And, his challenge to me was, once you realize how to navigate that piece, um, then everybody around you will be able to really be impacted by the way in which you show up. And so now that challenge to me, it always kind of stuck with me because I started to realize it. I started to recognize it. And I'll take you back to a moment where I had to 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 show it in practice, right? So that bowl game that I told you guys about, my senior year, uh, we were slotted to finish last in the country. I'm 20 out of 120 of all the college football teams, right? So going into that season, right, we had this mission that we were going to answer the call, and so we wound up going on a run. We get to the first bowl game in school history, and so we're in the New Orleans Bowl in the Superdome, as you can appreciate this, Renard. I'm standing in the middle, the 50-yard line, and I look up, and at the time it was the Mercedes-Benz Dome, right? And I look up, and it's just a voice that just says, "Take it all in." And I'm just like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna take this moment all in," right? And this was the game that was essentially going to be the deciding factor if I go to the NFL or not, right? So we're getting 10 minutes before the game. I mean, we're really about to go out there for the coin toss, and we're in essentially our last period before we get back into the locker room. And I'm going through like final walkthroughs, final steps, and in a freak accident, one of my teammates in the individual drills, he trips up and falls on my leg, and my kneecap just dislocates right there in the middle of the field.
Mm.
And in that moment, I was just like, are you serious? Right. I think I'm dreaming. I'm trying to wake up. And I mean, at that point, it just hit me like, oh no, you might not play this game. And so, the medical staff comes out, they, wind up, you know, putting my knee back in place on the field. I go off into the locker room and they're like, hey, we can take the pain away. And we could try that and we'll see what you can do. Right? So I go in, since I come out and I can feel the pain subsiding. But I remember all of my teammates coming up to me and I mean, they're just in tears. Seniors, guys that, some of the best players on our team, they're in tears and they're like, bro, you got to play. You got to play. You have to play. Right. And I just remember in that moment, like his voice kind of came in like, this is that moment. And so I realized very quickly, if I was sitting there on the sideline hurt that I'm not playing, that everybody else will be hurt on that sideline because I'm not playing. And so I had to flip a switch and I had to, hey, it's not about me today. Hey, we're going to win this game. And I had to just really just be a part of the experience on the sideline because that's all I could contribute. And, a lot of players that came up to me, they were just like, hey, I'm going to make a play for you. And they went out there and they made a play. And I'm like sitting on the sideline, just like in disbelief of like, wow. And so we wind up winning that game on a last second field goal. And we captured that first bowl game in school history. And I go back to that moment and I think about it because I feel like really in a true leadership, right, is when the lights aren't on you or the moment isn't on you, how do you respond to the moment? And in that moment, right, my influence wasn't on the field; it was on the sideline, and it was making sure that all the guys were up. And so I feel like, that's one of those moments where, nothing too high, nothing below you, right? Is you have to be centered on what it is that you truly believe. And so if I thought that I was too good of a player to, be like everybody else, I could have stayed in the locker room. I could have put a towel over my head and said, man, hey, I wish I was out there, right? But everybody, you would have never thought that I was the guy that got hurt. And I took pride in that. And I think that was something that really, shaped me going forward to be able to be in these spaces and to know that, that leadership is something that is truly about service. And, you're giving of yourself in order to make someone else, really, capture the experience that they deserve and for them to go further than you can. So that was the experience that I would say definitely defined it from a leadership perspective. And that moment really was a moment in action that I had to really show. And that was something that sticks with me for the rest of my life.
That is such a great story. I will tell you, if anybody has had a bad day, if they have heard your story, they have no reason to say they had a bad day. I mean, broken knee, still showing up with a big smile and winning the game,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's wonderful resiliency and a great story to share. And thank you for sharing that. So on that same note, on when somebody comes to you and says, they want you to come and mentor them, how does that story play into your style of mentorship? Just talk to us a little bit about how you mentor other leaders or future leaders.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Mentorship is huge, huge in my life, and especially something that I would hope is a part of my legacy. I would say for me, mentorship right now, as far as me supporting others, I just had my first intern here with the Raiders, and I thought that was really one of the best experiences that I got a chance to really be able to support someone who is early on in their career journey. Um, one of the things that I look at from a mentorship standpoint of me supporting others is really, you know, what is it that I can support you on? And then, of course, being able to, lend my philosophies that I picked up along the way from other leaders. And one of them is that conversation that I just had with you guys, right, about the influence part. Because especially when you come into a corporate space, right, it's navigation. You have to learn to navigate the space. A lot of times, if you're having a bad day, people may see it, right? And so I've learned to, incorporate that into aspects of what, I would want to essentially display and model. But also when I see, someone in our environment, that may look like shoulders a little slouch, kind of hung over, like, it could be a tough day in the world, right?
Mhm.
Football is not something that, at times, especially during training camp and things like that, we're supporting. And Vegas is hot. It's hot
I
here.
know it.
Amir,
I know it.
So, sometimes it's as simple as just, putting your arm around someone and saying, hey, man, I see you. I see you, man. But just, hey, make sure like let's put our chin up, and making sure that they're also seen too, right? Like that's kind of that exchange of, hey, I see you. I know that right now you're probably not in the space that you want to be in, but just make sure that you know that everybody's looking, right? And give them something that when they see you in this moment, make sure that you're giving them the best picture of who you are. And I think that's just one of those things about emotional intelligence, right? Is that you have to understand how you essentially are controlling and honing in yourself to be a vessel for others, right? Um, and so as I look at, from a mentorship of the mentors that I've had in my life, I've had, people that have come into my life that have, just poured into me. And I wasn't really in a sense looking for much, or I haven't, essentially established an expectation for what they could provide me. I was just really just, open to anything that they could offer me. And what I found was that, the vulnerability it takes to reach out and allow someone to mentor you, right? Because it's a two-way street. And a lot of times I realized that I'm not the best with accepting help. And I've had to really, challenge myself on why, right? Why these things? And so a lot of it was, allowing myself to put my guard down and say, like, this person really just wants to pour into you, to support you. Um, and Renard, you actually, we got connected through a gentleman named Samuel Davis, right?
Mhm.
And my first conversation with Samuel, we don't know each other from anywhere, but our first conversation, he told me, you know, hey, listen, I'm in the stage of life right now where this is a part of my legacy is to give back. And, for me, it resonated because, as we are in these spaces and we get an opportunity to, have these titles or whatever it is, the responsibility that comes with it, to hear someone who has, captured everything that they could potentially capture in their career, turn to someone else and say, hey, listen, what do you need? And what can I support you with? And this isn't, for their own, hey, I
Mhm.
want to tell everyone, that, hey, I get to, mentor this guy, but really to see you for you and say, hey, is there anything that I could help bring out of you that you may not have been able to tap into yet? And I thought that was something that really, encouraged me as I go through this journey of, making sure that I'm, essentially reaching back or, reaching out to others that can really, can really take some of the things that I've learned and be able to put it into their own. And especially as a social worker, I think that's something that I've seen tremendous. That's been tremendous for me is how many social workers, right? People who are in this field who see what I've been able to do and capture. And I remember being that student in class, seeing what other people have done, and it's like, man, that's so cool. I want to reach out to that person. I would love to sit down and talk to that person, but thinking that this person was, 100 degrees away from me.
Mhm.
And now I'm that person in the seat these days where, I mean, students are reaching out to me, professors, like people are reaching out and they're curious, right? And I want to feed that curiosity because I was there, you know what I mean? And I don't want to ever feel like I'm, hoarding a lot of this experience so no one else knows exactly what it is. I rather for it to be something that everyone, if they get a chance to learn a little bit more about it, if I can make it, connect to them, make it more relevant to the work that they're doing, then to me, that's pushing the work of the field further. And so that's been something that I've seen recently, especially during my time here, is that how many young social workers of those who are inspired about being in sports or being able to bring something to sports, and just being able to support them through that. So that's been really, I would say, that from a mentor aspect, those two, whether it's been allowing myself to lower my guard to really accept what mentorship can provide for me, and then the reciprocal aspect of being able to support others.
That's so first of all, kudos to you because I think there's a few things you've said there that I just want to acknowledge, and I think it's worth acknowledging. One of them is emotional intelligence, and I couldn't imagine somebody in your position not having just copious amounts of it. You'd have to have it in order for you to empathize with somebody else. But then you also said that, it's important for you to recognize that there's somebody who's giving back and just that access that you've given to the community, whether it's a teacher or student. So being accessible and having emotional intelligence. I think the acknowledgement I want to make here is that those are two very important leadership skills and leadership qualities that I think we can all take away is if you're not accessible as a leader, forget it. You're not the kind of leader that anybody would want to follow anyways. And secondly, if you don't have that emotional intelligence and building that muscle, you won't be able to empathize with the people you serve and work with.
Thank you.
You hit on some key points, Amir, and I also add to that. You added in about paying it forward, leaving a legacy and giving back to other people who are trying to decide what they want to do. And I'm gonna tell Amir, and Amir knows I don't do this often, but I'm gonna say that you are a black belt in your industry, man. You're a black belt. The What you're doing, I you can feel it in the conversation that you want to give back. You want to see other people do well in their journey as well as you're doing in your journey as well. Like you talked about Samuel, and we've had conversations about him, and he's one of those people who give back, and you're doing the same. So like-minded people easily connect with each other along the way because we all want to see each other grow and get better. So, yes, I will say that you are a black belt in your industry.
I love that. No, thank you for that. And just the way in which we think about what the black belt means in the art, right? What you essentially accomplish in the time that it takes to accomplish being a black belt, right? It's not something that's given to anybody. So I definitely am honored, by just the thought of that. And I think that's something that I would probably incorporate it to kind of share with people who understand, right, that aspect. Because I think that's a really cool translation.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
No, no, you're welcome. We definitely don't give them out easy, just like if you were training, it ain't easy, it's difficult, but when someone is ready. You know when someone is ready. If anyone who's listening, if you taught other people, been a teacher, you've been a coach, when it's time for somebody else. So, we definitely had to say that, and just the story that you've given us thus far has honestly, it's inspiring. It's an inspiring story that the connection between Louisiana and Vegas, you going back to a team that you tried out for, that you got an opportunity, and all of a sudden you're working for that organization. That honestly, that's a story in itself. That's what, like a movie. That's a movie. That's a movie in itself. So I commend you for what you're doing right now, and I wanna ask, thinking about the future, what does the future look like for you? What are you planning on? What does the future look like to you for the next 2, 3 years coming forward with that organization? What do you wanna do? What do you want your legacy to be with that organization?
Man, I would say definitely if it's service driven, I'm definitely on board for it. And I think that's kind of as I look at, people talk about their personal brand and kind of, what is it that's going to separate you from others, or what is the one thing that you feel as though you bring that separates you from others. And service is my strategy, as I would frame it. That's kind of where I lead from. I always, see it as an opportunity for me to extend myself to others. In the next 2, 3 years with this organization, I mean, really, with what I've seen and how we've essentially established ourselves here in Las Vegas, I just want an opportunity to support some of the highest opportunities or highest things within the organization, whether it's, growing from internal aspects or whether it's, being able to work on projects that, extend out into the community. But, ultimately, I never really center myself on a role. And I think the reason why is because I never really set out to do what I'm doing right now, right? I was doing, you know, things that I felt like, hey, this is within my wheelhouse. I'm called to do this, right? And so, I almost, to an extent, almost don't want to limit myself, right? By just saying, hey, it would be nice to do this because I really, it's more of a skill set thing. I want to be able to lend my skills as all of the skills that I've been able to capture through my time, whether that's, things I learned through the sport, whether that's things that I've learned, through my coursework and through social work, and things that I've learned while being here. I think just being able to bring all of that, to the forefront and be able to connect those things to aspects of the organization that, could help us, whether it's, through messaging, whether it's through capturing, community aspects or things in our community that we can go further on and expand upon. But one thing that I would say before I leave this organization, I would love the opportunity to support in any aspect players. Um, and I say that from a standpoint of being able to work alongside our alumni. and then to transition into our employees. The one aspect of the organization that I feel as though I haven't been able to touch is essentially players. And for me, I think there will be a time and a place for it, and then an opportunity to do something in that space. But that would be for me just one of the areas that I would really, if I were to ever leave and I would look back, I wouldn't want to have to be like, man, I wish I would have had a chance to be closer to that, you know. And I think, I just think that what I've learned, from the standpoint of working with the alumni, seeing the realities of what this game, essentially can be, that would be something that could be of a resource, to those current players that they're currently in it. And so, as time goes, we'll see. I've recently just jumped into this role and still learning, right? Still learning the aspects, the ins and outs, and learning a new industry as well. I've never really worked in human resources, and so just to capture those skills, and be able to, take those into and add them, into really the portfolio. That was, something that was big for me to really get a better understanding of, because I know, it's not a lot of people who make that transition from, whether it be social work or whether it be, supported players that go into human resources. And so for me, it's like once I'm in something, I get immersed and I just want to, gain as much as I can and, make all those worlds coexist. And so yeah, it'll be a incredible opportunity to have that opportunity to support players. But, in the meantime, right now, I know for our employees, it's I look at the work doesn't change, the population may, right? And so even when I was working with, youth in foster care, a lot of the things that I learned from a skill set perspective is relevant, the work that I do today. And so I always feel as though that every part of the journey has been relevant, to what I've been able to do or bring. And I always try to, share that with people as they tell me, "Oh, I'm just doing this now," or I'm only doing this," or they'll try to minimize something that they're currently, in. And listen, I was a substitute teacher for a little bit. And at the time, I was just hoping to get a PE coaching job, right? Or, I was, doing, things that I felt like, well, one day I'll have the opportunity to do something, larger, right? But I never looked at those things as underneath me, right? I always looked at them, this is where I am, and I have to learn from being here. Because eventually, if you are who you're supposed to become, you're going to be supporting people who are at this level too. And I always wanted to make and remind myself that you started here, and that's something that is important for you as you grow to make sure that you capture that. So, yeah, as the journey continues, I just hope to be utilized in a way that all these things that I've been able to capture in my time is just able to support.
Man, that's the way you get close to ending a podcast there, man. It's definitely inspiring. And I love that we get to have people like you on our podcast that inspire us as well as get to hear their journey. So, I know we're getting close to time and I ask everybody, what's your theme music when you're getting to the office? What gets you ready for the day?
Man, I was to think of a theme song that would capture it. Huh. It depends on what the day is and the genre of music.
It switches up every day. You give
Hey,
us your go-to.
trying to think of what I'm usually a podcast guy when I drive in. So it's usually either the Pivot, right? One of those sports podcasts, kind of hearing some stuff, especially when they're in training camp edition. But the one that I would say, if I would have a theme song to kind of go in, I would go with, hmm, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think my last few songs that I've listened to on the way in. I've been really engaged on um, so one of the biggest, I would say, influences through a moment in my time was Nipsey Hussle, right? Especially obviously an LA guy, but when he was essentially at his height, I got a chance to hear a lot of his messaging, right? And it was really about evolving yourself. And so if I were to pick a song, it would probably be a Nipsey Hussle song, uh, and probably I would go with "Grinding All My Life." That was probably one that I would pick as a good walk-in song if I were to pick one. But yeah, I think it would be that one.
That's a good song. Nipsey has a lot of great songs. I'll be honest. I'm a Nipsey fan, rest in peace, Nipsey, but great songs. Great songs. That's a whole nother conversation. So we don't have to go in that, but no, we are definitely elated that you were on here today. You gave us so many nuggets for our listeners. And one more thing before you go, what is one thing you would like to leave the Black Belt and Boardrooms audience?
If it was one thing that I could leave, uh, the audience with is, in due time. I think there's an art form to patience, in the pursuit of what you are wanting to accomplish, and I think that's something that I've learned along the way. I remember days where I would wake up and thinking I'm doing all of this work and nothing around me is changing visibly, right? And I remember committing myself to this idea that one day you're going to wake up and it's going to look drastically different than it did, and it happened. um, and so I really like to encourage people as they're on their way to their journey is don't minimize where you are in the moment, but really take it as a opportunity for you to, to further yourself, to look at yourself, look internally and understand, okay, if you're on this mission, what are you ultimately trying to accomplish? And, making sure that you're also staying aligned to the main goal. Um, and so, yeah, the patience part is definitely something I would leave with anybody on their journey, because I think we're all essentially growing and still expanding ourselves in all the different areas that we can. But I know sometimes for people, it could feel as though that I'm not making the progress that I should be making, especially comparable to others in this day and time, right? We have social media telling you every 5 minutes that someone else is outperforming you, right? And so I think that's the one thing that I would take, um, and also provide to others is just, have that patience. And while you're being patient, make progress.
That's the way you end the podcast right there. That is the way you end the podcast. So for our Black Belts and Boardrooms audience, we will see you on the next one.